Good evening and welcome to our personal growth Chabura. This week's parsha is Lech-Lecha. I hope everyone has a Chumash, a Torah in Hebrew or English, so we can look inside the text and study together and interact together as we go through the text. The Rambam, Maimonides, states in the laws of Avodah Zarah, the laws of idol worship. He says, when Avraham Avinu, Abraham overcame the idol worshippers through the strength of his arguments, the king, who is Nimrod, the king of Babylon, Nimrod, desired to kill him. He was saved through a miracle. That miracle was he was thrown into a fiery furnace and was saved by a miracle and left for Haran. He lived in Ur-Kasdim on the Euphrates River, Mesopotamia, Ur of the Chaldees. You can see it on a map at the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. He left for a town called Haran. There he began to call in a loud voice to all people and inform them that there is one God, and it's proper to serve him alone. He would go out and to call to the people, gathering him in city after city, country after country, until he came to the land of Canaan, the land of Israel, proclaiming God's existence the entire time, as Genesis Bereshis states, and he called there in the name of the Lord, the eternal God. So Avraham began his journey of investigation of the study of the universe, astronomy, the physical world. At the age of 3, he contemplated the world from a simple age of 3 years old. Simplistically, as he got older, he became more sophisticated until the age of 52. From the age of 52, he began to believe in God, one God who ran the entire universe. And then he began to spread that language, that message of one God to the world from the age of 52 until the age of 75. For 23 years, he taught the world about one God. At the age of 75, our parsha opens. At the age of 75, the parsha of Lech-Lecha opens, and God speaks to him for the first time after he investigated the universe and God for 48 years, from the age of 3 till 52, teaching about God's universal presence, monotheism, belief in one God for 23 more years to the age of 75. And then finally, for the first time at the age of 75, God speaks to Avraham Avinu and says the following. And let's open up our parsha, open up our Chumash, and let's look at together the words of the parsha as they open. God said to Abraham, Vayomer Hashem el Avram, his name was not Abraham, but Abram at that time, Lech-Lecha me'artzecha u'mimoladetcha u'mbeis avicha el ha'aretz asher areka. Hashem said to Abram, go for yourself from your land, from your birthplace, and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. That's the first communication that God made after 75 years. He spoke to Abraham. The question results as follows. If Avraham was supposed to be the father of the Jewish nation and the founder of monotheism, ethical monotheism, belief in one God and the standards of behavior that are required by an ethical God, why doesn't the Torah itself, in the Torah text itself, describe the process of how he came to believe in God? The commentaries, the Rishonim, Rashi, Rambam, as I just describe how he came to that process. But the Torah text itself does not describe the process of how he intellectually came to believe in God. The Torah is silent on how he became a ma'amin, a believer in Every man, woman, and child only knew the worship of trees and stone until the pillar of the world, Avraham, was born. As soon as this giant was weaned and began to use his mind, he posited how it was possible that this great universe could be operating with a guide and a director. And who was that guide, says the Rambam? And he came to know that there was one master who guided this universe, and he was the creator of everything, and there was no reality other than him. So this is the Rambam, the commentaries, the Rishonim, Rashi, Rambam, comment on how he came to believe in one God. But the Torah text itself doesn't say anything about how he arrived at believing in one God. In the Medrash Rabbah in Bereshis, chapter 39, Parsha 1, brings the Medrash as follows. And God said to Avraham, go from your land, your birthplace, and from your father's house, Lech-Lecha Go go out from your homeland, your father's house, and your birthplace. Says the Medrash, to what may this be compared? To a man who was traveling from place to place, when he saw a palace in flames. The man wondered, is it possible that the palace has no owner? The owner of the palace looked out and said, I am the owner of this palace. So too, that's a mashal, that's an example, that's a metaphor. Now the Medrash goes on with a nimshal, with the application of that story, and says, so to Abraham, our father said, is it possible that the world lacks a ruler? God looked out to him and said, I am the ruler, the sovereign of the universe. So according to the Rambam, the Rishonim, Avraham contemplated the universe, uses his intellect to understand that the ebb and flow of the universe did not happen by itself. And he came to believe in one God, and he began to teach that. But the text of the Torah itself does not tell us how he arrived at that conclusion. Avraham Avinu was the first person to hear God speak to man. Not only did God literally speak to man, to Avraham, when he said, Lech-Lecha, go out from your house, but the way he arrived at that conclusion, that there was one God, is that he heard God speaking to man through the universe itself. He saw the universe, he contemplated the universe, he contemplated the stars, the constellations, the galaxies, the human mind, the human being, the animals, the flow of photosynthesis, how the world worked. And he came to conclude this cannot be happening by itself. The word in Hebrew for speak, to speak, is called daber, to speak. The Hebrew word for thing or matter is called davar. Every davar in the world, everything in the world has the word of God in it, dibur. The dibur of God became a davar. The word of God became crystallized into a davar, into a thing. God said, let there be light, and there was light, yihi or. Vayomer Elokim yihi or, vayihi or. God said, let there be light, and there became light, which means that within the light, there is the word of God, which means that Abraham looked at the light, looked at the sun, looked at the setting of the sun, looked at the moon rising, and said, there must be speech in this system. There must be a word of the director and guide of the universe who is speaking to me through the rising of the sun, the setting of the sun. So he heard, so to speak, dibur in the davar. He heard God's words within the davar, within the speech, within the matters that he saw in the universe. He heard God speaking to him. So he saw, just like the traveler who saw a palace in flames, he saw that this palace cannot be flaming, be burning by itself. Someone must have set a match to this palace. So too, some being must have ignited this universe and set it in motion as the creator and is supervising this universe. That's how he came to understand there was a God. These two concepts of creator and supervisor are called in Hebrew Borei Umanhig, the creator who also supervises. In Friday night Kiddush, we raise our Kiddush cup and we testify just like Abraham did. We say, Yom HaShishi, Vayichulu HaShamayim V'Aretz B'chol Tzva'am. On the sixth day, God created the world. He finished creating the world. On the seventh, he rested. Vayivra Elokim es Yom HaShvi'i Vayikadesho. So Kivo Shavas Mikol Melachto Asher Bara Elokim Lasos. He created the world in 6 days. The seventh day he rested. That's God as creator. The second paragraph of Kiddush after the bracha on the wine is Veratzavanu Zecher Liyetziat Mitzrayim. We recognize Shabbat to remember going out of Egypt, that we came out of Egypt as slaves to Pharaoh. We became a servant of God, and therefore we keep Shabbat because God supervised the world, is intervening in the world, is involved in the world, is a personal God involved in the history. He supervises and guides history and took us out of Egypt and continues to guide us every single day. And therefore that's God as supervisor. The first paragraph of Kiddush says God is the creator. He created the world in 6 days. On the seventh day, he rested. The second paragraph talks about God guiding us and taking us out of Egypt, which means God is involved in our lives. That's God as supervisor. So Abraham sought out the source, the creator. This must have been created by a higher being. That's God as creator. And how God supervises our lives. He's involved in our lives. He's a personal God. That's called divine providence. He recognized that God is not only the creator, but also the supervisor. Borei Umanhig. At that time, people were worshiping trees and stone. Why? Idol worshippers. Not because they were primitive simpletons who just thought that idols created the world. Rather, they were expressing that the idols were their vision of the world. So they envisioned the idea that an idol is static. Wood and stone is static, and they felt their vision of the universe was the world was a static universe. It was set in stone, set in wood, always been here. Nothing changes. It's only a world of cause and effect. There was no plan, no planner, no creator, no guide. There's just wood and stone. That was their view of how they viewed the world. So they worshiped idols, meaning that their view of the world was idols. The world was a place of idols. Everything was predetermined. Everything was fixed in stone. So they worshiped the idea of fixed in stone. They worshiped idols, not because they were juvenile, primitive Neanderthals, simpletons. They had a view of the world, which was that the world is static, doesn't change. There is no such thing as free will. Everything is fate. Everything is predetermined. And therefore they worship that concept by the symbol of worshiping idols, which were stone and wood. On every mountain, every hill, every tree, there were Asherah trees. They bowed down to the Asherah tree. They bowed down to the Baal. They bowed down to the gods, so to speak. The gods was the universe itself. They didn't believe in a God who created the universe. They believed that the universe was God. And therefore they bowed down to idols. Came along Avraham, and he contemplated that this must not be happening by itself. The amazing first time a person had that kind of thought, when he went against conventional wisdom, that there is not a static universe, that there is a creator and a plan and a planner of this universe, God, as Borei Umanhig, and he was hated for that view. He went against conventional wisdom. He was not politically correct or religiously correct. It was a radical thought. And he taught it to the world. And Nimrod, the king of Babylon, put him in jail and was trying to execute him. by putting him in a fiery furnace for his beliefs. Because if you believe that there is a God who is creator of the universe, then Nimrod, the king, lessens his power. And therefore, his view of the world, Abraham's view of the world, threatened the political order. And therefore, if you believe in a God that we have to serve a higher power, then it means the king is not above the law. And Nimrod said, I am the law. So he had to put him in jail. He had to have him executed, so to speak, or attempt to do so. Because otherwise, his view of the world, Abraham's view of the world, is threatening the hegemony of Nimrod. So this is an amazing process, an amazing thought that he had, a novel, radical thought. Why doesn't the Torah say, before it says Lech-Lecha, why doesn't what the Rambam says about the trees and the idols and the people who worship idols and worship, why doesn't the Torah itself say at that time that there were people worshiping idols and that they were worshiping trees and that they saw the idea that the world was a static universe and everything was a matter of fate? Came along Abraham, who contemplated the rising of the sun and the setting of the sun and the ebb and flow of the universe and the tides and the sea and the oceans and the stars, the constellations and the plants and the whole system. And he became to believe in God so that we could emulate Abraham. Wouldn't we be able to point to Abraham and say, look, anyone who has a doubt about God or about believing in God, follow the Torah, look inside the Torah, see how Abraham came to believe in God, and we'll also come to believe in God. Wouldn't that be a proof text to any atheist or any person who has doubts about God? Follow Abraham. He was the first person who lived in a secular world, in a religious world, which was believing in the religion of idols. And he came to believe in God. Why doesn't the Torah mention that? Why doesn't the Torah describe that process? The commentaries describe it, but not the Torah itself. Why not? Couldn't we believe? Couldn't we learn from him? Now, there is a book called Permission to Believe. I want to show this book to you. It's called Permission to Believe. It's written by my good friend, Rabbi Leib Kellerman. Lawrence Kellerman, Leib Kellerman. Permission to Believe. 4 rational approaches to God's existence. I want to encourage everyone to read this book. Pick it up on Amazon for $10. And in it, he talks about 4 possible approaches to the belief in God. The Rambam, elsewhere in Laws of Yesodei Torah, says the mitzvah, the obligation, is not only to believe in God, but to know there's a God. Lehamin viladas, to believe in God and to know there's a God. That's the mitzvah of Anochi Hashem Elokecha. I am God, I am Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. Says the Rambam, that mitzvah is to believe and to know God. Now, I ask you, we can believe in God, but how do we know God? Let's explain this as follows. If I say, I believe it's raining outside, how do I transform my belief that it's raining outside into knowledge whether or not it's raining outside? I hear outside, I hear it's dripping on the roof. I hear the noise, I hear the thunder, I hear lightning. I believe it's raining. What do I need to do to transform my belief that it's raining into fact, that I know it's raining? I go outside, put my hand out, look outside, and I see whether it's raining. What am I doing when I do that? When I go outside and put my hand out, and I look at the rain, and I feel the rain, what am I doing? I am gathering evidence as to whether or not my belief is correct. So the way to transform belief into knowledge is to gather evidence, to gather data. I believe it's raining. Let me gather the data. Oh, it feels like it's raining. It looks like it's raining. It sounds like it's raining. It must be raining. Now I know it's raining when I go outside. Or I go outside and I see it's not raining, so I know it's not raining. But my belief must be tested by gathering data and evidence to test whether or not the belief is true, and then I transform it into evidence. this book, Permission to Believe, and what Abraham did. He went outside, he looked at the stars, the constellations, he contemplated the universe and said, you know what? I'm gathering evidence of whether or not there's a God. This is what this book says. Permission to Believe has 4 proofs. I'll briefly mention them, but I encourage you, everyone, to please get this book. It's a very, very inspiring book, very short, very thin book on the 4 rational approaches to God's existence. He brings the moral approach, the moral evidence, not proof, moral evidence. The name of the book is 4 Rational Approaches to God's Existence. Approaches, evidence. There's no proof of God's existence. There is evidence to transform our belief into knowledge. Number 1, the moral approach. If we say that murder is universally and absolutely evil, as dictated by a universal creator and guide of the universe, by God, we are saying that only God could create a law which says that murder is illegal, that murder is absolutely and completely evil. So we're saying that some people say, well, that's not true. Murder, the law against murder, is a human construct. Man developed that. Asks Rabbi Kellerman in his book, what human being has the right to dictate to the rest of the world that murder is illegal? No human being has that right or that power. It can't have been made by man. Well, then you'll say it was done by society. Society came along and said murder is illegal and universally evil. But that's not true, because many societies believe in infanticide. They condone cannibalism, and they believe in euthanasia. So many societies don't believe murder is wrong. Assisted suicide, some societies say that's allowed. Dr. Krikorian. So if you're saying that murder is against society, first of all, society doesn't say it's wrong. There must be a higher power, higher than society, and some societies say it's legal. And Nazi Germany said it was legal to kill Jews. Innocent Jews, women, children, men, adults, homosexuals. Gypsies, anyone who didn't believe in what they believed in. Stalin said those who don't believe in me, what I am preaching, don't believe in the motherland, are killed. 40 million people. Mao Zedong, they said murder was okay. So how can you tell me that man said that murder is illegal? Or the society says it's illegal? It must be according to the moral proof, or moral evidence of God's existence. There must be one higher power which said murder is absolutely evil. The cosmological approach, second approach, cosmological. The universe is found to be an open universe, which means it's expanding. The universe is expanding in all directions. A man named Vesto Slipher in 1925 found that 42 galaxies were traveling away from the Earth at the rate of 700,000 miles per hour. 42 galaxies are traveling away from the Earth, expanding outside from the Earth toward infinity, toward eternity, toward outwardness, openness, in all directions at 700,000 miles per hour. That was 1925. Edwin Hubble, you heard of the Hubble telescope? That's looking for the origins of the universe in space. He found that every galaxy within 100 million light years of Earth is expanding, exploding outwards. Not only 42 galaxies, like Slipher found in 1925, but Hubble found that there were every single galaxy around the Earth is expanding outwards. In 1965, Penzias and Wilson detected the radiation of that moment when the world began to expand. the philosophical and spiritual and theological repercussions of having an expanding universe means the world is not static. That according to the idol worshippers and according to Aristotle, the world is static. It remains still. It doesn't move. It always has been there, like a stone idol or a wooden idol. That's what they believed. The world was always there. There was no beginner. It was always there. There is no free will. We have no power to go against cause and effect. If we help each other, that was predetermined from the beginning of time, and time is forever. There's no beginning of time. That's the Aristotelian view. That's the idol worshiper view, that the world is predetermined and static and not an open universe. It's called a static universe. But science has found that the world is not a static universe. Science has discovered that the world is an open universe, expanding, which means that there must have been a beginning point. And this is what they call it. On page 40 of Permission to Believe, Rabbi Kellerman quotes the following. At the 1990 meeting of the American Astronomical Society, Professor John Mather of Columbia University, an astrophysicist who also serves on the staff of NASA's Goddard Center, presented the most dramatic support ever for an open universe. According to a journalist present, Mather's keynote address was greeted with thunderous applause, which led the meeting's chairman, Dr. Jeffrey Burbidge, to comment, quote, "It seems clear that the audience is in favor of the book of Genesis, at least the first verse or so, which seems to have been confirmed. The theological ramifications of an open universe are that there must have been a beginning point. And what does it say in the Torah? Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim ves haaretz. That the source created the universe in order to recognize the source. The source means a beginning point. As we said, Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim ves haaretz does not mean in the beginning. It means God created source. God as source created heaven and earth to recognize the source. The source means the Big Bang. The source means that God is the creator of the Big Bang. And from that moment on, time began. If you will, in the beginning. There was a beginning of time, which goes against Aristotle and against the idol worshippers, that the world is a static universe. Science has proved Avraham right. The world does not want to believe it. This is evidence and allows you to have permission to believe. That's why this book is called Permission to Believe. He's giving us evidence to permit us to believe in the creation of the universe by God. Then there is the third proof, the teleological proof, the system of DNA, that how in the human eye there are 120 million sensors, which are black and white sensors, and 7 million color sensors in this eye, in our eyes. How could that have evolved? And he talks about evolution and the evidence of evolution and the counter evidence, and we're not going to debate that tonight. But the DNA, the solar system, leads one to believe, on page 61 of Permission to Believe, and he says the following. New York University's Robert Shapiro considers the probability of 1 in 10 to the 39,950th power. That's 1 in 10 to the 39,950th power for the production of a bacterium to be optimistic. He wrote in 1986. A tidy set of 20 amino acids, all in the L form, was not likely to be available on the early Earth. Instead, Shapiro endorses the probabilities calculated by Dr. Harold Morowitz, a Yale University physicist, who says there was a 1 chance in 10 to the 100 trillion that a viable bacterium ever evolved on Earth. Shapiro observes, this number is so large that to write it in conventional form, we would require several 100,000 blank books. And if the odds of evolution producing a bacterium are 1 in 10 to the 100 trillion, then the odds of producing a human being are closer to 1 in 10 to the 1 zillion 250 trillion, about the same odds as a gambler using ordinary dice rolling 100 trillion consecutive double sixes. So is this proof of God? No. It is evidence of God. We're doing a search of data. I want you to do your own data search. The fourth proof that Rabbi Kellerman brings is the Jewish history proof that the Jews are still here. And he quotes the famous Mark Twain article in 1897 in Harper Magazine, who says the following. Mark Twain wrote of the Jews, quote, "If the statistics are right, the Jews constitute but 1% of the human race. It suggests a nebulous dim puff of stardust lost in the blaze of the Milky Way. Properly, the Jew ought hardly to be heard of, but he is heard of, has always been heard of. He is as prominent on the planet as any other people. He has made a marvelous fight in the world in all the ages, and he has done so with his hands tied behind him. The Egyptian, the Babylonian, and the Persian rose, filled the planet with sound and splendor, then faded to dream stuff and passed away. The Greek and the Roman followed and made a vast noise, and they are gone. Other peoples have sprung up and held their torch high for a time, but it burned out, and they sit in twilight now or have vanished. The Jews saw them all, defeated them all, and is now what he always was, exhibiting no decadence, no infirmities of age, no weakening of his parts, no slowing of his energies, no dulling of his alert and aggressive mind. All things are mortal but the Jew. All other forces pass, but he remains. What is the secret of his immortality? Evidence of that there must be a God guiding Jewish history and the principles of the Torah, which are needed in the world in order for the world to be a civilized place. Witness the looting that's going on in Philadelphia tonight and around the United States, and decide whether or not this world needs a Torah, needs civility, needs a universal standard of behavior. So I'll bring you a fifth proof, the design proof of God. The design proof of God is, take a look at this lectern, the stender. Do you see the craftsman, the carpenter who made it? No, he's somewhere else. But if you say that this stender with its corner, this corner right here, and this corner right here, happened by itself, is to suggest that you find corners in the universe. If you go in any forest or go anywhere in the world, you will never find a natural tree which is formed with a corner, with a sanded corner like this. That's the movie 2001 that found an obelisk on some outer planet, or the moon, I believe. An obelisk has 4 sides. Someone must have put it there. It doesn't lend itself to find its way that way in nature. Obelisks don't exist in nature unless someone crafted them. So this corner must have been crafted. Do I see the craftsman? Is he here right now? No. So by looking at the design of the universe, we see that therefore there must have been a carpenter who made this stender, who made this lectern. So too, therefore, if this was made of wood, then this wood piece corner was created by someone who isn't here, but who is invisible, and yet made this, because this doesn't happen by nature, in nature by itself. Therefore, the raw materials that went into making this, the tree, the wood of the tree that went into making this, also must have had a designer. The raw materials of this stender, this lectern, made of wood, must also have had a designer. And therefore, we have reason to believe, we have evidence of the fact, the design proof, there must have been a designer of everything we see in this universe. Whether it's man-made, must have had a designer, and the raw materials must have also had a designer, the creator God. Man did not make trees. You'll argue with me and say, trees evolved. We have to study that issue and look at the book, Reason to Believe, study the gaps in the evolutionary theory. We can have our views back and forth on evolution. We can debate the issue, but study the counter view that evolution is not possible to have happened within the time frame of the 15 billion years of the universe and the missing evidence, etc. I'm not going to go into that argument, but there is evidence to believe that it's not possible for the world to have evolved in the 15 billion years that we've had a notice of in this world right now. So why didn't the Torah, why didn't God write the book, Permission to Believe, and write it in the Torah itself? Why didn't God take this book, Permission to Believe, and write the contents in the Torah and said there is a moral proof of God, there is a cosmological proof of God, there's a teleological proof of God, there is a Jewish history proof of God, there is a design proof of God. And Abraham talked about all these things, thought about all these things, and therefore anyone who wants to search for God, study these 5 proofs, and there are many more pieces of evidence of God's existence, evidence. Go study them and believe in God, like Abraham believed in God. Why doesn't the Torah discuss that? Now comes to the answer. Let's come to the answer and says the following. The Maharal tells us the answer as to why the discussion of how Abraham came to believe in God is not in the Torah. Says the Maharal of Prague. Avraham Avinu, Abraham our father, was not chosen by God because of his intellectual process through which he discerned God and discovered God. It is not the process before he discovered God that we are interested in. Rather, he is Avraham Avinu, Abraham our father, for his process after he discovered God. The Torah is not a book about belief in God or emunah. It's not a belief and a study of faith. It's a study of faithfulness. Emunah means belief in God, intellectual belief in God. The Torah discusses Abraham and not his process of emunah, because the Torah is about bitachon. Bitachon means the certainty of our holding on to our faith in the face of adversity. That is what faithfulness means. And therefore the story begins with Abraham's 10 tests. Lech-Lecha, go out of your homeland, your father's house. Lech-Lecha me'artzecha, from your homeland. Mimoladetcha, from your birthplace. Mibeis avicha, your father's house. Ela arz asher eka, to the land I will show you, is because I want to show the world, says God, that Abraham, you are a man who trusts me. You have faithfulness to the belief that you've already established. You already established a belief in God. You've studied God. But that's not what we're talking about here in the Torah. The Torah is not a book of faith. It's a book of faithfulness. It begins with Abraham as the father of the Jewish nation. We had Adam and Chava. They didn't have enough trust and certainty in God. Noah had a greater certainty in God, or faithfulness in God, by following God's will, by building the ark. Adam and Eve did not have that faithfulness. They had faith, they believed in God, but they didn't have faithfulness. They were not faithful to God's word. Noah was. But the first person to be able to apply that and to live that value was Abraham. So he was not chosen for his emunah, his intellectual faith. He was chosen for his bitachon, his faithfulness. The word bitachon comes from the word batuach. Batuach means certainty. The certainty is our certitude that we believe that we can trust God by following his will and by submitting ourselves to his halacha, to his will that's written in the Torah. And the Torah was dictated word for word by God to Moshe Rabbeinu over a period of 40 years. It began at Mount Sinai and continued in the Ohel Moed, the laws of Vayikra, of Leviticus, and followed in the Midbar, and followed as Devarim before Moses died. The process of 40 years is in the Torah. God dictated word for word to Moshe Rabbeinu. And therefore, that's what we live by. Our faithfulness is what's discussed in the Torah, not our faith. Not our amunah, but our bitachon. Of course we have to have amunah. Of course we have to go outside. You don't need the Torah for that. You don't need amunah, faith, for the Torah, says the Torah, says the Maharal. You don't need the process. Discover the process yourself. Go outside, count the stars, look at astronomy. And the Rambam says, go outside, contemplate and behold the universe, and you immediately become in love with God. That's not a matter of the Torah's requirement. That's a precursor to the Torah. That's a necessary precondition to beginning the Torah. The Torah really is about faithfulness, not about faith. So we have to hold on to our faith in the face of contradictions to our faith. And God is the solver of all contradictions. So therefore, we begin our study of faithfulness, of bitachon, of the Torah, by studying the 10 tests of Avraham Avinu. And not only do we study Abraham's 10 tests, but the Nesiva Shalom tells us, the Borovsky, who I received a bracha from 4 months before he passed away in Jerusalem. I taught his Torah when I lived in London, England, and I had to meet him. I received a bracha from him on a Saturday night, Motzei Shabbos, in his home in Mea Sha'arim. And the Nesiva Shalom says, Rav Noach Borovsky says the following. He says, just like Abraham had 10 tests, thereby every Jew who is a great-great-grandchild of Avraham Avinu goes through 10 tests. Abraham went through 10 tests, and each of us go through 10 tests of faith. The 10 tests of faith are not, should I paint my bathroom blue or green? That's not a test. That's not a choice. Choosing whether I can have rice for supper or fish is not free will. Choosing to go to Florida or California for my vacation is not a choice. That's not called free will. Free will means a free moral choice. Should I or should I not murder? Should I or should I not steal? Should I or should I not speak evil talk against somebody? That's a moral choice. That's a free will choice. What are the 10 tests of Abraham? There is a machlekes. There's an argument between the Rambam and Rashi as to what the 10 tests are. I will share with you Rashi's list of 10 tests to simplify matters. The first test of Abraham was that Nimrod wanted to kill Abraham, and he had to hide underground for 13 years. That's found in Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, chapter 26. The second test of Abraham was Nimrod, the king Nimrod cast him into a burning furnace. Quoted in Rashi, chapter 11, verse 28. The third test, God exiled him from his birthplace. The third test of Avraham Avinu is the beginning of our parsha. Lech-Lecha me'artzecha u'mimoladetzcha b'savicha ala artz asher areka. He said, go from your birthplace, your homeland, and your father's house, and go to the land I will show you. That's the third test. To leave your homeland at the age of 75 with your family, your wife, your children. I had no children at that time. And to leave with your entourage and go to a foreign land. Oh, leave my homeland, leave my business, leave my family, and go. That was a test of faith. Do you believe you're going to trust me? You come to believe in me, God says. You understand that I am the one who causes the flaming universe. Why is that medrash that we quoted earlier talking about a flaming castle? Because a flame burns up fuel and then burns new fuel right now, which means that there's a renewal of the universe. Why a flaming castle? Because that represents the idea of the renewal of the universe. It burns up new fuel. It takes fossil fuels. The world is burning up fossil fuels. The world is expending fossil fuels. And therefore the world has a renewable energy within itself that God put in the world, renewable. And therefore was a flaming. Why a flaming castle? Because flames represent renewability. The fourth test, God brought a famine during his lifetime. Chapter 12, verse 10 of Genesis, of Bereshit. That when he came to Canaan, Israel, God promised to make him a wealthy man. I'll take care of you. He came to Canaan, came to Israel, there was a famine. That's another test. So what did he do? He went down to Egypt, where there was no famine, because there was a Nile River. The Nile River was always there, providing produce, irrigation of the crops. They didn't have to rely on drought. The famine happened because of a drought. People had to pray to God. In Egypt, there was no prayer to God. There was always the Nile. The Nile was their God because the Nile provided them with sustenance. So it irrigated their crops. It didn't dry up, never dried up. Therefore, they believed the Nile was their God. So he went down to Egypt. The fifth test was while he was in Egypt, Sarah was abducted by Pharaoh and Avimelech, and she was returned to him. The fifth test. The sixth test was he had to wage war against Hadar Laomer and his allies when they took Lot, his nephew, captive. The seventh test. At the covenant between the parts, Bris Ben Absarim, God showed him a vision of the subjugation of his descendants at the hands of the four kingdoms, which means Abraham saw us. The first exile, the Babylonian exile. The second exile, the Persian exile. The third exile, the Greek exile. The fourth exile we're living in right now, the Roman exile. In 70 of the Common Era, we were exiled from Jerusalem. The Second Temple was burned, and we were exiled to the four corners of the earth, to Babylon, and then on to Europe, and from Europe to Baltimore, and to Chicago, and to Toronto, and Montreal, and Argentina, and Chile, and Japan. Exiled to the four corners of the earth. And we are living within that fourth exile, the longest exile, the 2,000-year exile right now. And God showed him the four exiles in the Bris Ben Absarim, in the covenant of the parts. That's a faith. That's what you're going to make me father of the nation that's going to be exiled for generations, for thousands of years, for 2,500 years. I don't want to be a father of that nation. Are you going to hold on to the faith that you came to believe in? You believe in me? Now let's see whether you have faithfulness to trust that I'm going to run this story. As Mark Twain says, to stay here, to stay with our faith, to stay with our traditions and our law and our adherence to morality. After 2,500 years, no other nation is doing that. The eighth test, God commanded him to circumcise himself and his son. Chapter 17, verse 10 of Bereshit. The ninth test, God told him to send away both his son Ishmael and Ishmael's mother Hagar. To send away your son Ishmael and your wife? To divorce her, to send her away? That's a test of faith. A test of faithfulness. And the last test, God told him to send away both his son. God commanded him to sacrifice his son Isaac. The 10th test, the final test, which we'll talk about next week. Parshas Vayera. So not only are there 10 tests of faithfulness, and that we also go through our 10 tests of faithfulness. And our personal avoda, our personal work in our this week's chabura, of how we can grow from this parsha, how we can learn from this parsha, is I want everyone to write down your 10 tests of faith. When were you challenged in a matter of faith? Write them down. My first test of faith, my second test of faith. Should I start keeping Shabbat or not? Test of faith. Someone teaches you about the Torah, about God, about the Creator, about the universe, and you have to decide. You read the book. You read the book. Permission to believe. So, well, there's evidence of God's existence. Maybe I should keep Shabbat. Test of faith. Then you have a test of, well, I'm going to be working, but I have to leave on Friday afternoon for Shabbat, but I'll lose my job. So am I going to hold on to my faith? That's a test of faithfulness. Am I going to be faithful to the God I believe in? A second test you might have had. A third test, someone might have lost somebody. And anyone who loses somebody, it's a test of faith. How can a good God do that? Or when a young child dies, it's a test of faith. Or when a person has marital troubles, test of faith. Why is God doing this to me? I want everyone to write down your work this week. Write down your 10 major tests. Now, it may not be 10, because I'm at test number 6 or 7 of my life. 6 or 7 tests of my life. Major theological, philosophical, spiritual tests of my life, of believing in God, of testing my faithfulness in God. It may not be 10, maybe 6 or 7. But if you trace them, if you mark them on a map, 1, 2, 3, you will find something very unusual and very astounding. You will find that God is speaking to you through those 10 tests. God is guiding you and directing you as to what is your life destiny. Each test refines the previous test. Each test refines some particular act of character or portion of character of your personality. It's defining, refining, challenging, molding, shaping who you are. The 10 tests are good tests because the purpose of life is not happiness. The purpose of life is growth. The Vilna Gaon tells us the purpose of life is shviras hamidos, to grow in character. And each of these 10 tests that are given to you by God, whatever number of tests you're at right now, is given so we can grow as a person to become the best person you can become. Take a look at these tests. What is God saying to you? God is speaking to you. Just like Avraham spoke, God spoke to Avraham Avinu. Diber with his speech. In the things that he saw the trees and the stars and the moon and the light. He said, God is speaking to me through the davar, the matters, because the dibur of God is in those things. So too God is speaking to us, dibur. He's speaking to us through the matters with which he presents us. The events of our lives are the dialogue between us and God. That's divine providence. He's the creator, but faithfulness comes from divine providence. Faithfulness. Emunah comes from believing there's a one God, like Abraham did. That's emunah. But the Torah begins not with his faith, but with his faithfulness, the 10 tests, which means the divine providence of God being involved in your life. What does God want from me? What do you want from me, God? Well, take a look. Take a look at the 10 tests. Where are you? What does he want from you? Chart them. I guess God wants something from me. To hold on to my faith. In what dimension? How does that improve me as a person? How does that make me grow as a person? Think about it. That's how we grow. The purpose of a Torah is to grow, is to become a better person, a more sensitive person. And therefore, ask yourself through these 10 tests, let's say, I want to share with you that thank God, Baruch Hashem, my son got engaged. And we're having Simcha Mirtz Hashem. We're having a vort on Sunday at our home here in Baltimore. And when people phoned us with genuineness and said, I'm so happy for you. I'm really genuinely, sincerely happy for you. And it was Simcha, it was a beautiful thing. You can tell the warmth in their voice. I asked myself, do I do that when I say Mazel Tov to somebody else? I say, Mazel Tov, happy for you, very nice. But do I really feel it like it was my Simcha? But some people wrote to us or phoned us or left messages or called us and said, I'm so happy for you. I really felt it. That's a test of my faith. 1 second. Do I do that? So I'm learning from this experience that I have to make myself more sincere, more genuine, more feeling of their simcha when they have a simcha as opposed to my simcha. Or someone else's pain. Do I say, oh, I'm so sorry that happened to you? Or, wow, that hurts me like it hurts you. I think that these tests of faith cause us to be more sensitive, more compassionate, more empathic to someone else's pain when I have a pain. Or when I lost my mother 8 years ago, people came and they genuinely supported me and they gave nichum avelim. I felt really that was so nice, so supportive. When I go to a shiva, I just sit there, and I try to be supportive. But it was so meaningful to me that because of the loss, it made me more sensitive when I go to a shiva. And the question I ask at a shiva, which is really the most important question to ask, is not how the person died, because the person sits and relates the past week or 2 weeks of how the person was in hospital and they died, and that's a process they have to go through. But the real question to ask at a shiva is, how did this person live? What was the legacy of this person who gave you a message to give over to your children? What was their life message? And I ask this question at every shiva I go to, and many people say, I spoke about my father or my mother. I didn't really think about what the legacy that they gave over to me to give to my children was. And I learned that from going through my own pain of the loss of my mother. And therefore, I learned that from that pain, I can become a more sensitive person. That was one of the tests of my faith. Do I really care about someone else's loss? Do I care about someone else's simcha as I'm experiencing now? Am I really genuine? Am I sincere? I have to be a growing person through the experiences that happen to me in my life. That's a test of my faith. So I want you to write down, what are the tests of faith that you've experienced in your life? And chart them and ask yourself the question this week in our personal growth chabura, how can I grow? What is God telling me? What is he teaching me? How can I grow as a person to become a more sensitive, compassionate, empathic, caring person to others because of these tests? But there's another dimension, and with this we'll close. There's another dimension of 10 tests, and that is the same type of tests that Avraham went through are the same types of tests we go through. And I'll mention 5 types of tests that Abraham went through, and let's see whether we can relate to those tests and apply that to our lives. Number 1, he was thrown into a fiery furnace. That's a test of conviction. Where in your life is your conviction, your faithfulness tested? Number 2, famine. He was promised by God that there was going to be riches and largesse and bounty in the land of Israel. He got there was a famine. He had an expectation. Don't we have tests of expectations? I have an expectation that's going to be like this. And then it turns out like that, not like this. That's a test. Are there moments in your life where you had expectations which were disappointed? What did Avraham Avinu do? What did he do when there was a famine? Did he say, I'm out, God. I'm done. I'm out of here. You promised me? Forget about it. You promised me? It must mean God wants me to go down to Egypt and find food there. And he came back to Canaan. He came back to Israel afterwards. So perhaps a message of lost expectations or unfulfilled expectation is go with the flow. Keep moving. Maintain your faithfulness. That's a test of faithfulness. Number 3, his wife was kidnapped twice by Pharaoh and Abimelech. And he had to send away Hagar and Ishmael. That's a sense of loss. I lost the wife. She's been taken from me. I lost my wife and son, taken from me. Do we experience loss? That's a type of test in our lives of faithfulness. That when we experience loss, we have to maintain our faithfulness. That God has a reason. God has a reason for this. I have to learn and grow from it. Have you experienced loss in your life? Any type of loss? That's being like Abraham. He had losses in his life. When Lot, his nephew, was captured, he had to fight a war. What wars are you fighting? What are your Maginot Lines? What are you fighting for? What are you willing to fight for in your life? It's a test of faithfulness. Stand up and say, I'm going to be counted in this area. I am not going to budge. I am going to go and make this change. And to sacrifice Isaac, the 5th test, the 5th type of test. There were 10 tests, but the 5th type of test, to sacrifice Isaac. Are you willing to give up something for the higher power? Are you going to sacrifice something for the higher power? For your faithfulness in God? So when Abraham went through the test of fire, thrown into the fire, to stand up with conviction. Do we stand up with conviction for what we believe in? That's a test that we have to live and grow from. Let's work on that this week. Strength of conviction, believe in something. Expectations. The famine. Do I have expectations that are not fulfilled? What are you going to do about it? Survive those lack of expectations and keep going. Losses. Maintain our faithfulness despite the losses. Fight for something that you believe in. Fight a war. A valid war. A worth it war. Something you want to fight for. And sacrifice. What are we willing to sacrifice for? Therefore, we conclude with the following. Faith is not a single static moment or momentary flash of godly revelation. I believe. Oh, I see God. I believe. That's not what faith is. Faithfulness is a process which develops in our mind and our heart over time. It's a process. It does begin with emunah, with an intellectual awareness, a consciousness that there is a God, that I could not do this. I'm in awe of God. That's what yirah means. Yirah does not mean fear of God. Yirah means awe of God. I'm in awe of God. I couldn't made this tree, or these stars, or this galaxy, or these galaxies traveling away from Earth. I'm in awe of God. Yiras shamayim. But then that awe, that emunah, is refined, tested, and emerges from within ourselves, bitachon, faithfulness, to maintain our faith despite the challenges, the tests, the crises, the ordeals, and the contradictions to our faith in God. When we're tested by these trials and crises of faith, and we hold on to them, we go beyond faith, we go beyond emunah, and we arrive at the level, the beautiful, deep level of bitachon, faithfulness. Hope to see you next week. God willing, on the Parshas Vayera, we'll talk about the Akedah and how we can raise ourselves up to a higher level. Thanks for listening. Hope to see you next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.